let's take a brief overview of the specs before we get into my thoughts. This is the Nomos Club Campus 38, reference 726. It's got a 38.5mm case diameter. From lug to lug, it's 49mm, just about there. 8.5mm thick. The movement is the in-house caliber alpha, which is a manual wind movement with the power reserve of 43 hours. A movement thickness of 2.6mm. That's really thin. The crystal on this watch is domed sapphire glass. The strap is velour grey leather. And the watch has got a water resistance rating up to 100 meters, which is pretty surprising regarding how thin the watch is and how thin that actually makes the friction fit case back. So now let's get into the positives. So the watch sits nice and flat on the wrist. It has no problem sitting under a somewhat tightly fitted sleeve. I had to check often that the watch was still on my wrist. I would suddenly get freaked out and wonder if it fell off or something, because it's a review unit and not my own, so that would be an even worse outcome. But thankfully, it was always there, happily positioned under my sleeve. Now let's talk about the dial. So the green. Electric green is what they call it. I find it to be a more subtle shade of green. It's got a nice, soft and matte looking texture to it. It's not a piercing green, and that would also be a lot harder to match. This is a lighter shade of matcha. I say matcha green because the texture is very similar even though the color is not the same shade. Now the question is this green the color to have? Well, here's the facts. With multiple bright color options, you can't avoid pondering what it would have been like to have purchased the other color that you were considering. So if you like it on first sight, go for it and forget about the rest. Rest assured that your instinct led you to pick this color in the first place, and hence you would have had buyer's remorse had you picked another color. At least that's how I view it. Now the color aside, there isn't too much going on in the dial. The configuration of the indices is known as the California dial style, and this is denoted by the upper half being Arabic numerals and the lower half being Roman numerals. This makes the watch a little bit more lighthearted and playful, which makes sense with this sort of colored dial. What I find most special about the dial is the sub-dial. The sub-dial is subtly perfect, in my opinion, recessed without any contrasting color contour lines around it. Now, the seconds markings are also lightly printed on the dial, and you don't notice it unless you're really looking for it or it's up close. The bright fluorescent orange seconds hand provides a lot of contrast, which some of you may not like, but I think it works well with this shade of green. Something I find odd is that all the Club Campus watches share this seconds hand. That's really odd. I think it doesn't work well in the coral and yellow watches. The colors are too close and they seem sort of mismatched. Perhaps someone into color theory can explain this in the comments. Now moving on to the Lume. The Lume on the hands is decent but nothing spectacular. It's not like Seiko Lume. It's much more mellow, but it lasts reasonably long. At night in a pitch black room you can just about faintly make out the time, after a few hours have passed naturally. One thing that helps this is the simplicity of the dial and the sparse but reasonably large indices. Now let's talk about the case. This watch wears larger than expected because of its case dimensions, particularly in terms of the lugs. You notice that the watch is very classically dimensioned. Just looking at the case, it looks like it could be from 100 years ago in terms of design simplicity. I'm talking particularly about the case, not the entire watch. I really expected to dislike the lugs and for the watch to wear a little small on my wrist. I'm used to wearing watches that are between 40 and 45 millimeters. But yet, this didn't wear small due to the protruding lugs. They really stick out far from the case. And that is something I typically really dislike in watches, because it implies that there's going to be a gap between the strap and the case, and you can see your wrist through that gap. And that's something I really don't appreciate. But once I wore this watch, I realized it's not a deal breaker for me, at least on this piece. Of course, I don't desire these lugs. I would rather them be shorter, but it's not the end of the world. I'm also not a fan of how the bezel leads into the lugs. I think it could be designed to slope into the lugs and look a lot less abruptly joined. The crown, on the other hand, is a pleasure to use, which really speaks more about the movement than the crown itself. Nomos' in-house movements are the main thing that draw me towards the brand. To me, it's more of a USP than their design language, and that, I know, is a big statement, but it's true. The crown does look pretty utilitarian though, but yeah, asking for more at this price point would be a bit much. So I get it. Now let's talk about the movement, my favorite thing about Nomos watches. This movement is what makes the watch for me. This is Nomos' first caliber, hence the name Alpha. This is perhaps one of their most important movements, as it's present in a lot of their watches, including what I think is the Nomos watch, the Tangente, or Tangente, if you're saying it in German, I guess. The fact that you're getting this quintessential Nomos movement in their least expensive watch shows how seriously they take watchmaking, and shows how much they care in making this watch not just fashionable, but also true to what their brand is. There isn't something comparable in this price range purely because of the movement being developed in-house. And in the case of Nomos, they really take the definition of in-house seriously, just like all their other watches. Naturally, it's more of a bare bones movement than their more expensive and complicated watches, but I still adore the fact that it's there in this base watch. Now, lastly, the strap. I've got to say, the strap is premium as hell. There is absolutely nothing I can fault the strap for. It is probably the best velour leather strap I've ever experienced. Actually, it's probably just the best leather strap I've ever experienced. I'm assuming the velour will pick up color quicker than desired, but still, I'd get this strap. It barely creases and it doesn't look worn despite having worn it for 2 weeks, and it's also not stiff. It's rather compliant and sturdy. Not to mention, it's extremely comfortable on the wrist. This is a lot of strap for the watch you're getting. Very well done, Nomos. So now, on to the negatives. What are the negatives? The bezel is rather polished and somewhat prone to fingerprints and scratches. Here you can see there's a light scratch that I actually put on the bezel. Unfortunately, I just rubbed my wrist against the underside of my desk, which is metal, so naturally that happened. It's a really polished, shiny bezel. It's bound to get scratched. In my regular wear, apart from this incident, it actually didn't get scratched, which is also a nice thing to note. The watch is too easy to wear. It makes you feel the weight of every other watch you choose to wear, and only then do you begin to notice how much easier and forgettable it is, and it was, to have the Nomos on your wrist instead. Now, this is not really a criticism of the watch, but just how kind of special it is and how unique it is. So I guess that's sort of a positive. Now, the watch is manual wind, which is kind of cheeky because it pretty much forces you to wear this watch and set your other automatic watches to the side. You just feel the urge to keep this one ticking because you know how comfortable it is on wrist, and it really goes in so many different dress scenarios. Another thing is that the watch is not sporty. If you're looking for something to bash about, something sporty, this really isn't the one. Nomos watches need a little bit more care and respect, and in return, they make it really easy for you to wear them. The crystal on this watch is far too reflective. I think my annoyance with this comes from the angle of someone trying to film watches and make them look equally nice as they feel in person. And this watch makes that task very hard, particularly when out and about in daylight. Viewing angles are naturally better in person, but still, I feel that in direct sunlight, where you can really appreciate the vividness and richness of this dial, there aren't as many angles to get the most out of it as you could have had it been equipped with a better anti-reflective coating. Now, the crystal is also domed, which increases reflections, so that's another thing to note. It's very slightly domed though. It's not a large dome. So overall, what are my thoughts? The watch is great fun for someone that's either lacking flair in their collection or looking to get into finer, more tasteful and expensive-ish watchmaking. I don't really fit in either of these two categories at the moment, and that's why I'm not getting one of these exact watches myself. It was great to wear it as a daily for a couple of weeks. I know I want to own a Nomos watch, but I just know that this exact piece is not the one. I kind of really like some of their tangentes, and I think that would be more exciting, especially something with a display case back. I guess I need to try them out. And that's the detailed review of this watch done. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next vid. Cheers.